Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I never expected my return home to be anything other than a relief, a simple conclusion to a long, exhausting business trip. But as I stepped out of the cab and onto the platform that night, something felt wrong. The air was cold, biting, more than it should have been for a late evening in early autumn. My breath misted before me, swirling in the stillness, the only sound in the world. The station, if you could even call it that, was eerily deserted. No station attendants, no scattered travelers, not even the hum of distant footsteps or the faint chatter of someone on their phone. Nothing. I glanced up at the flickering overhead lights. Their dull buzz was the only sound that cut through the thick silence. A shiver ran through me, but I tried to shake it off. It was late. Maybe too late for anyone else to be around. The city had its own rhythm after dark, and this station, well, it just happened to be caught between the hours of that rhythm. I rubbed my tired eyes, my body aching from the endless meetings in airports. The business trip had drained me, but I was almost there. Just a quick train ride home, and I could finally collapse into my own bed. That thought kept me moving toward the platform. Then, the train arrived. It wasn't like the others. No screeching of wheels or rush of air. The sound was eerily smooth, too smooth. The train itself slid into view with a quiet grace, its massive form almost too perfect in the dim station light. It looked out of place, almost unnatural. I couldn't help but feel a cold, deep unease crawl up my spine as the train stopped in front of me. Its gleaming black surface reflected the harsh light from above, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made it seem as though it didn't belong in this world at all. I didn't hesitate. I was too tired, too ready to end the night. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside. At first, everything felt fine. The train was exactly what you'd expect. Polished wooden floors, soft lighting, plush leather seats that promised comfort for the long ride ahead. But as I walked down the aisle, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. It was far too quiet, too still. There were no other passengers. Nothing moved. The seats were perfectly arranged, every cushion smooth and undisturbed, as if no one had sat in them for years. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I should have turned around, I know that now. But I didn't. Instead, I found an empty seat near the window, sat down, and tried to settle my nerves. The train jerked to life, a soft lurch that almost made me jump, but the movement was smooth, almost soothing. The rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath the train had an almost hypnotic quality. It was familiar, comforting. I closed my eyes for a moment just to rest, to clear my head for the briefest of seconds. But when I opened them again, I realized something was wrong. The train had stopped. My pulse quickened. I didn't know how long I'd been asleep, but the train had come to a complete halt. I looked out the window, expecting to see a station or at least a familiar city street. But there was nothing. Just a void of blackness, as if the world outside had vanished. The lights beyond flickered, illuminating nothing but empty tracks and endless night. No buildings, no cars, no sign of life. It was as if the station had evaporated into thin air. I stood up, a tight knot of unease tightening in my chest. I moved to the door and pressed my face against the glass, staring into the dark abyss. I couldn't see a thing. The world had been swallowed by the night, and the train felt like it was suspended in time. Frozen. Then, I saw him. The conductor was standing at the front of the car, tall and gaunt, almost impossibly still. His uniform was pristine, black with gold accents that shimmered faintly in the dim light. But his face, I couldn't make it out clearly at first. His features were hidden in the shadows, his eyes dark and hollow. His presence was unnerving, and I couldn't seem to tear my gaze away from him. I approached him, heart racing. "What's going on? Why are we stopped?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I'd intended. The conductor didn't answer at first. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking. His silence was more unsettling than any answer could have been. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded toward the door. I followed his gaze. The train's door had silently slid open, revealing nothing but an empty platform, wrapped in darkness and mist. No sign of any station, no light, no movement. Just silence. I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. "Where are we?" I whispered more to myself than to him. The conductor didn't speak. He simply turned, his long, deliberate stride leading him toward the back of the train. As if guided by some invisible force, I moved toward the door, curiosity clawing at me. But before I could reach the exit, the train jerked to life again, its sudden motion almost throwing me off balance. It resumed its journey down the endless tracks, and I watched in confusion as the world outside remained a black void. I turned back toward the car. The conductor had disappeared, and the passengers, those few I'd seen sitting in their seats earlier, were still there. They hadn't moved. Not a single one of them had shifted an inch. Their eyes were vacant, their faces expressionless. That was when I felt it. The heavy, suffocating weight of realization creeping in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't just a train, and I wasn't just traveling home. Something had gone terribly wrong. I tried to shake it off, to push the thought from my mind. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me after a long, exhausting trip. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The train moved on, the darkness outside pressing in closer, and the silence growing heavier with each passing second. I should have gotten off, should have run away, but I didn't. And now, I don't know if it's too late to escape. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I had to. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong with the train, with everything. But I forced myself to breathe deeply, to focus on the hum of the train, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath us, as though that would somehow bring me back to a sense of normalcy. The exhaustion from my trip was still clinging to me, and I just wanted to sleep, to close my eyes and escape into oblivion for a few hours. But the passengers around me kept catching my eye. They sat completely still, not a single one moving. At first, I thought it was just the lateness of the hour, or maybe they were just deeply absorbed in their own worlds. But there was something unnerving about their stillness. Their eyes were open, wide and unblinking, but there was nothing behind them, no emotion, no recognition, just empty, endless voids. A woman sat a few rows ahead, her black hair cascading perfectly over her shoulders. It looked almost unnatural, as if it had been sculpted, not brushed. Her skin was pale, so pale that she looked like a figure carved out of marble, lifeless and cold. Her lips were slightly parted, as though she was about to speak, but no sound came. Her expression was fixed in place, completely vacant. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. There was something so wrong about her. It was like she was there, but not really there. Her body was a shell, and her eyes, they were nothing more than empty windows into a soul long lost. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I quickly looked away, trying to shake the chill that had settled over me. But as soon as I turned my gaze elsewhere, I found another. Across the aisle, a man was sitting rigidly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore an old tweed jacket, frayed at the edges, the fabric faded and worn, like someone who had lived in that jacket for too long. His face was haggard, deep lines etched into his skin, his eyes locked in that same vacant stare. He didn't blink, didn't move, but his fingers, they twitched. Not in a normal, organic way. His fingers jerked, as though they were forced to move, caught in some sort of mechanical loop. The longer I looked at him, the more I noticed. The edges of his form seemed to blur, like he was fading, or slipping through the cracks of reality. It wasn't just his stillness that was unsettling. It was his existence itself. He was there, but only barely. I didn't understand it, but I felt it deep in my gut. This man, he wasn't right. My heart started pounding in my chest as I turned to the window, desperate to look away from the disorienting sight. The train was moving through nothingness, just a vast sea of black, and outside there was nothing to ground me. The sense of unease was suffocating, pressing down on me with every passing second. Then, there was a sound, a faint, shuffling noise coming from the back of the car. I turned toward it, and that's when I saw him. An old man, hunched and frail, sitting at the very back, by the window. He hadn't been there when I first boarded. I would have noticed. But now, there he was, his gnarled hands gripping the armrests, his eyes gleaming with something strange, something far too knowing. He looked at me with an intensity that froze me in place, his gaze sharp, piercing. I couldn't look away. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping against the ground. I stared at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Was he just another passenger lost in the quiet? Or was he something else? The old man leaned forward, his hands trembling as he spoke again. "This train, it doesn't stop. You're not going where you think you are." His voice was strained, almost broken, but there was a chilling certainty in his words that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt my heart skip a beat. I didn't understand. The train was just a way to get home, right? It was just a late ride, nothing more. But the old man's eyes darkened, and his voice lowered to a rasp. "Look around you." His hand gestured to the other passengers, those silent, unmoving bodies. "They're all the same. They're all dead." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't process them. "What are you talking about? They're just sleeping, aren't they? It's late." I stopped myself, realizing how foolish it sounded. The old man shook his head slowly, the sorrow in his eyes palpable. "They don't know. They don't even know they're gone." He gripped the armrest tighter, as if the act of holding on to something real was the only thing that kept him grounded. "And soon you won't know either. You'll fade, just like them, lost." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him that he was crazy, but I couldn't. There was something about the way he spoke, so filled with despair, with knowing, that made me feel as though every word was true. I looked at the other passengers again, really looked at them. And that's when I saw it. Their eyes, their faces, so lifeless, so unblinking. But it wasn't just their stillness. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker of something behind their gaze, something that made me feel as though they weren't aware of the world around them anymore. They were trapped. But trapped by what? I tried to shake it off, but the old man's words echoed in my mind. "You're already on it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the train. "You're already lost." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like the world had tilted, like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to understand. I glanced around, looking for an escape, but there was no exit. The car stretched on forever, filled with silent passengers who seemed more like shadows than people. And then, without warning, the old man was gone. His seat was empty, as if he had never been there at all. But I knew he had been real. I knew what he had said was true, even if I didn't fully understand it. I looked around the train, and for the first time, I felt a creeping sense of terror that I couldn't shake. I was stuck on this train, and there was no getting off. Not ever. The door to the next car slid open with a soft click, and I didn't know if I should move forward or stay where I was. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. The train didn't stop, and I couldn't escape. The other passengers just stared ahead, their eyes empty, their bodies stiff, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and I was already one of them. The train's motion was almost hypnotic. The steady rhythm of the tracks beneath us, the soft hum of the wheels, should have been soothing, but it wasn't. No matter how many times I glanced outside, there was nothing but a pitch-black void. I kept waiting to see something, anything. Perhaps a distant streetlight or a flicker of the city passing by, but the window remained just as empty as my thoughts. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion. It had been a long trip, after all. Long flights, endless meetings, and now this late-night train ride back home. I should have been asleep, but something in the air felt off, like the weight of the silence itself was pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. And then I saw him. I hadn't noticed him when I first boarded, but now, sitting in the farthest corner of the car, was a man. Old, hunched over, his clothes faded and torn. He looked as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were sharp, piercing through the darkness, and the moment they met mine, I felt a chill race down my spine. There was something about him, something unsettling. It was like he wasn't just looking at me, but through me, as if he knew something I didn't. I tried to look away, but his gaze held me captive. He slowly leaned forward, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed too loud in the otherwise suffocating silence. "You shouldn't be here, son," he said, his words like a warning carried on the cold air. I blinked, confusion flooding my mind. "What? What do you mean?" I stammered, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't understand. The old man didn't answer right away. He simply sat there, his eyes still fixed on mine, as if weighing my very soul. Finally, after a long, drawn-out pause, he spoke again, his voice low but filled with an unnatural certainty. "This train, it's not what you think, it's not just a ride." A shiver rippled through me. My thoughts raced. Was this some kind of joke? A madman on a late-night train? Maybe I was just too tired to think straight. But there was something in his words, something in the way he looked at me, that made it hard to dismiss him completely. "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to keep calm. "I'm just trying to get home." The old man's lips curled into a twisted half-smile. It wasn't kind, it wasn't reassuring. It was filled with a kind of sorrow, like he knew a truth I wasn't ready to hear. "You're already gone," he whispered. I froze. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, thicker. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not dead, I'm just on a train." The old man shook his head slowly, as if I were too far gone to understand, and his eyes darkened. "We're all dead, boy, every single one of us on this train. We died a long time ago, and now we're stuck, trapped. The train never stops, you'll never get off." I laughed, a nervous, hollow sound. This couldn't be real. He had to be crazy, delusional. I was just on a train, right? Just another stop before I went home. But the old man's face remained unmoved. His eyes were wide, filled with something far deeper than madness. There was fear there, too, a kind of ancient terror that I couldn't ignore. This train, it's a trap. Once you get on, there's no getting off, no destination, just endless, empty tracks. He leaned forward, his voice turning urgent, desperate. Do you see them? Do you see them all around you? I turned to look at the other passengers, their faces frozen in place, their eyes unblinking, lifeless. I had noticed them before, of course, but I hadn't really looked. Now, the sight of them filled me with a creeping dread. They were still, too quiet, as if they were not even alive, but something else, something hollow. I looked back at the old man. His gaze was unflinching. You can't escape, he whispered. Once you're on this train, you're stuck. Forever. Just like me, just like them. I tried to speak, to dismiss his words, but my mouth felt dry, like I couldn't find the words to argue with him. I didn't know what to say. I was dizzy with fear, the very weight of his words pressing against me, suffocating me. You'll see, he muttered, his voice breaking with a quiet despair. You'll see soon enough. This train doesn't go anywhere. It just goes on, and on, and on. He looked at the other passengers, his eyes growing distant. You're just one more soul being dragged into the void. His words hung in the air like a curse. The more I tried to shake them off, the more they burrowed deep into my mind. I glanced around the car again, my heart pounding, and I realized that the people around me weren't just quiet. They were vacant, like mannequins, bodies with no souls, eyes that didn't blink. The old man's seat was empty now, as if he had never been there at all. I stared at the spot where he had been, and for a brief, terrifying moment I wondered if he had been real. Had he been just another passenger like the others? Or had I imagined him? But I knew, deep down, that what he had said was true. I was already on it. The train had already begun its journey, and there was no turning back. I wasn't going home. I wasn't going anywhere. I was stuck, trapped on a phantom train that would never stop, never reach its destination. I looked out the window, hoping to see something, anything, that might prove I was wrong. But there was only darkness, endless darkness. The train was moving, but the world outside remained frozen, locked in a void. I pressed my face against the glass, my breath fogging the surface, and I whispered to myself, barely believing the words as they left my lips. I'm not getting off, am I? The silence of the train was the only answer. I don't know how long the train had been moving, hours, maybe more, but it had begun to feel like we were suspended in time. The steady hum of the wheels on the tracks, the rhythmic sway of the car, should have been comforting. But it wasn't. It was suffocating. The air in the car felt thick, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I could barely breathe, as if the very atmosphere of this place was holding me hostage. I tried to focus on anything else, but the longer I sat there, the more I realized that nothing was moving outside. I glanced through the window, hoping to catch sight of a familiar station, or even a flicker of light from the city, but there was nothing. Just a void. A crushing, oppressive blackness. The old man's words echoed in my mind, replaying like a broken record. You're already dead. You're stuck here. I pushed the thought away, but it clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Could he have been right? Was I already lost? The train jerked. At first, it was subtle. A slight lurch, nothing more than a momentary shift. But then, the train came to a complete stop. I froze, My heart skipped a beat as the weight of the silence hit me. The world outside had been swallowed by darkness, but now the train was completely still. The usual hum, the noise of the wheels on the tracks, was gone. There was only nothing. The stillness in the car was unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thudding loud and rapid, as if it were trying to escape from my chest. I stood up, my legs shaky as I reached for the door, desperate to break the unnatural stillness that gripped the train. I pressed my hand to the cold metal handle and pushed, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the train doors opening. But the door didn't budge. It was locked, jammed, as if the train had decided that we were not allowed to leave. I turned, frantic now, my eyes darting around the car. The passengers remained in their seats, frozen. I tried to focus on their faces, but they were just as still as before, their vacant eyes staring ahead, unblinking. No one moved, no one spoke. It was like we were stuck in a moment, frozen in a place that didn't exist. I moved down the aisle, my footsteps loud and clumsy in the oppressive silence. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening. The door at the front of the car loomed ahead, dark and uninviting. As I reached for the door, something caught my eye. A flicker, just outside the window. It was so fast that I thought I had imagined it, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Only darkness. I felt my pulse quicken, my skin prickling with unease. Something was wrong. Wrong in a way that went beyond just the train. It wasn't just the passengers, or the conductor, or the stillness. It was the entire place. The train, the space we were in. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Then I heard it. A sound. A low, grinding noise, like metal scraping against metal. It came from deep within the train, somewhere far beneath the floorboards, as if the very bones of the train were protesting. The sound was so unsettling, so unnatural, that I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't over. The train wasn't just stuck, it was fighting, struggling against something. But what? The car shuddered, and the lights above flickered for a moment, plunging us into darkness before returning, dimmer than before. The air in the car had grown colder, and I could see my breath, white and thin, swirling in the icy air. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that it sent a shock through me. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stave off the creeping chill. A second lurch shook the car, this time much more violent, and it threw me off balance. I stumbled, catching myself on one of the overhead handles, trying to keep from falling. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. The shadow outside the window, it was there again, just for a split second. But this time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was something real, something moving, pacing just outside the train, out there in the dark void. I pressed my face to the glass, heart pounding, desperately trying to see what it was. But there was nothing. No shape, no form, just the same endless blackness. The train continued its relentless crawl through the void, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. Watching me. The whispers started. At first, they were so faint, I thought they were just in my head. But then, as I stood frozen by the door, the murmurs grew louder, so faint and soft that I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. They were coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but the passengers remained as they had been, motionless, blank. The whispering didn't stop, though. It was coming from them, I realized. From the people sitting in the seats, their vacant eyes staring forward as they muttered in low, ghostly voices. And then it hit me. The voices weren't just whispers, they were screams. A low, muffled wail that was trapped beneath the surface. the souls of the passengers. Trapped. They were speaking to me, trying to warn me, but I couldn't hear them completely. They were stuck, just like I was. I turned back toward the door, desperate to get out, to escape whatever was happening to us. But before I could even move, the train lurched again, this time with an eerie smoothness that made my stomach lurch. We were moving again, moving forward, but not toward anything. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to some semblance of control, but I knew it was no use. The train wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't going home. It wasn't going anywhere but deeper into the void, and I was being dragged along with it. And then, in the flickering lights of the train, I saw the conductor. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and his lips parted in a thin, cold smile. He was the only one moving now, but there was no escape. I don't know how long we'd been moving, hours, maybe more, but there was something about the train that didn't feel right anymore. The hum of the tracks beneath us, the steady sway of the car, it all seemed so distant, so out of place. It was like I was floating, no longer anchored to anything real, as though the train was no longer a vessel taking me home, but something else. I tried to ignore the feeling that gnawed at me, but I couldn't. The air had grown thick, suffocating. The silence that pressed down on us all felt unnatural. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the occasional flicker of the overhead lights couldn't break the spell of stillness that hung in the air. I turned my gaze to the window, hoping to see something familiar, a station, a city street, anything that would prove I was on the right track. But all I saw was darkness, endless blackness. Not even the faintest glow of distant streetlights, just a thick void that swallowed the world whole. The train lurched, a sudden jerk that threw me against the armrest. My heart skipped a beat as the car rattled and groaned, its old metal protesting against something unseen. The lights above flickered just once, but it was enough. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I didn't know why. My mind raced with thoughts of getting home, of returning to something familiar, something real. But when I looked around, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The passengers, the other people on this train, the ones who had been so still, so lifeless, were the same as they had been before. But now, their stillness seemed more than just sleep. It was something worse, something deeper. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, but the moment I moved toward the aisle, I felt it. A sudden sense of wrongness in the air, the walls of the train, the seats, the very floor beneath my feet. All of it felt hollow, distant, like it was just a shell. Not a real train at all, not a real place. I pressed my hand against the window, trying to steady myself, to find some anchor to reality. But when I looked outside again, there was nothing. No stations, no roads, no buildings. Just an endless stretch of darkness. The tracks we were on, were they even real? My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a simple late-night ride home. I could feel it now. The train wasn't just moving through space, it was moving through time, and not in the way I thought. We weren't going anywhere. We were stuck. Stuck in some terrible loop, and I realized, too late, that I had been trapped the moment I boarded. The old man's words flashed in my mind, his haunting voice echoing through my thoughts. "You're already dead. You're trapped here, with us." A cold shiver raced down my spine as I stumbled back to my seat. I felt dizzy, lightheaded. The train moved forward, but it wasn't taking me anywhere. It was taking me nowhere. It had taken me nowhere from the very beginning. I wasn't just traveling through space. I was trapped in a moment, caught in a place that didn't exist in the real world. I looked around at the passengers, their empty faces locked in place. They weren't just silent, they were dead. Not in the way I had thought, not just some ghostly presence. They were lost. Their souls trapped in this place, just like mine. And I had become one of them. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? There was nothing left to say. I was stuck in this nightmare, caught in this train, and no matter what I did, there was no escaping it. I reached for the door, but my hands were trembling, my vision blurring, and my body felt as if it were floating, disconnected from the reality of the car around me. It was then that I felt it. The air had changed. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, thin and white, hanging in the air before me. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. It was as if the train itself had turned against me, its walls closing in, its motions becoming slower, more deliberate. It wasn't just taking me through the dark, it was consuming me, drawing me deeper into something I couldn't understand. I turned my eyes toward the conductor. He was standing there, his face still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his gaze on me. His presence was a cold weight pressing against me. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. It was like I had been swept into the current of something too powerful to resist. The train jerked again, more violently this time, as if it was being dragged through some invisible force. The lights flickered and dimmed further, casting long shadows across the car. I looked out the window again, desperate to find something, anything, that would tell me I was just imagining this, that I wasn't actually trapped. But the blackness outside swallowed the world. The train wasn't going anywhere, it wasn't supposed to. And that's when I realized. I wasn't just a passenger on this train, I was part of it now. I had boarded not to return home, but to ride for eternity. This wasn't just a journey, it was a trap. The faces of the passengers around me began to shift. They were still lifeless, but now their expressions seemed too familiar. They weren't just victims of some strange fate. They were witnesses. They were waiting. They were all waiting for the same realization to sink in, that we weren't going home, not anymore. The train was moving, but not in the way I thought. It was dragging us through time, through some endless loop that would never stop. It wasn't just a train, it was a prison, and I was locked in it, just like the others. The train lurched forward again, its motion smooth and relentless. I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just the sound of the train moving, it was the sound of us moving, further and further away from anything real. The train had become a vessel for the lost, a cage for the forgotten, and I was one of them. I looked out at the endless dark. There was no end, no station, no home. There was only the train, taking me deeper into its eternal night. I wanted to scream, to fight, to escape, but I knew it was useless. There was no escape. I was already lost. And now I would ride forever. I could feel it now, the weight of it, settling over me like a shroud, suffocating and cold. The train had resumed its movement, but it wasn't like before. It wasn't just the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks anymore. The very sensation of motion was different. It was wrong. The train didn't feel like it was going somewhere. It felt like it was moving through nothing, dragging me further into the dark, into something I didn't want to understand. I glanced out the window again, desperately searching for any sign of life outside, anything that would tell me I wasn't trapped in this nightmare. But there was nothing, just that endless blackness. It was as though the train was floating in some kind of void, cut off from everything. There were no stars, no cities in the distance, no light, just pure, oppressive darkness. I turned away from the window, my head spinning. The old man's words echoed in my mind, his voice growing louder with every passing second. You're already dead. You're stuck here with us." I shook my head, trying to force the thoughts away, but they clung to me like a heavy fog. I wasn't ready to believe it. I couldn't. I had to be alive, right? But everything around me was telling me otherwise. The other passengers, they were still, too still. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. I stared at them, each one of their lifeless eyes locked in an endless, vacant stare, and I realized something then. They weren't just frozen in place. They were waiting for something I didn't understand. I felt my chest tighten and my breath caught in my throat. The train, the passengers, the darkness. It was all starting to make sense in a way that terrified me. I wasn't just stuck in a strange, endless journey. I was part of it now. I had become one of them. A lost soul, trapped on this train, destined to ride it forever. My hands started to shake. I pressed them against my face, feeling the coldness of my skin. It was too cold, like my body was shutting down. The warmth of life was gone, replaced by an unnatural chill that sunk deep into my bones. I could feel it now. I was already slipping away. Already dead. I stood up, the motion disorienting as I staggered down the aisle, my legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to get off. I needed to find a way out. But the door didn't open. The train kept moving forward, but there was nowhere to go. There was no station, no exit, no relief. Just an endless, unbroken journey. And then, I saw him. The conductor. He was standing at the front of the car, watching me, his face still obscured in shadows. But now, his presence felt different. It wasn't just the coldness that emanated from him. It was something deeper. A kind of knowing. He wasn't just there to guide the train. He was its keeper, its warden. He was the one who had trapped us all here. His lips parted into a thin, cold smile. "You've figured it out," he said, his voice soft, almost mocking. "You're not alive, not anymore." I took a step back, my heart racing. "No," I gasped, shaking my head, trying to deny it. I'm not dead. I'm just tired. This is just a mistake." But the conductor didn't move. He didn't need to. His eyes, hollow and dark, locked onto mine with a knowing stare. "There's no mistake," he said, his voice low and filled with something dark. "You're already gone. We all are. We're just riding." The words sank into me like a heavy stone. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but the truth was too undeniable now. The train wasn't just taking me somewhere. It was taking me nowhere. I was stuck. There was no going back, no escape. This train, this endless journey. It was all I would ever know now. I looked around, my vision blurred with tears I couldn't shed, my chest tight with panic. The passengers, they weren't just staring into the void, they were waiting. They were waiting for the realization to come, waiting for me to understand that this train was not a way back home. It was a prison, a never-ending, unrelenting loop, a ride to nowhere. I felt the train lurch forward again, the movement smooth and unbroken, and I realized with a sickening clarity that it would never stop. The carriages, the walls, the very seats, they were all part of it. Part of this eternal trap. The conductor stepped toward me then, his presence almost suffocating as he reached for the door. I wanted to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. The weight of it all, of this truth, crushed me, and I stood there, frozen in place. "You'll never leave," he said, his voice cold and final. "Not ever." I turned toward the door, hoping for some miracle, some way out, but as I reached for it, I saw it. The door didn't open, it was locked, and the walls of the train, the very air around me, had closed in. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. The reality of it all was too much, and it consumed me. The train kept moving, but it wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't going anywhere. I was just trapped. I looked out the window again, my vision clearing for the briefest of moments. The blackness outside wasn't just a void. It was the same void I felt inside. I wasn't going home. I was never going to see the outside world again. The train kept moving, but I was already gone. I was already one of them. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.